Yeah, this is my keynote lecture on the Northern Renaissance, and all of this material relates to Chapter 17, Section 2 of our Unit 3 material. Remember that we use a unit system, so Unit 3, we're currently on Unit 3, and Unit 3 consists of Chapter 17, 19, and 20. Okay? So here we are in Chapter 17, Section 2. All right. The Northern Renaissance is a term from history that refers to developments in arts, science, medicine, uh, religion, philosophy that occurred throughout Western Europe outside of the Italian peninsula. And so that's why, if you notice, we referred to the Italian Renaissance, and now we refer to the Northern Renaissance, and that is the Renaissance movement that occurred outside of the Italian peninsula. Let's go on to our next slide. What are some qualities of the Northern Renaissance? Well, one, the Northern Renaissance, and again, we're talking about the Renaissance events, the Renaissance culture, like that notion of I appear to be reborn. If you remember that quote, "Mi pare rinascere," I appear to be reborn. Well, that was happening outside of the Italian peninsula as well. And so, what were some of the qualities of this Northern Renaissance? Well, one, it was marked by what we call religious piety. Now, piety is basically is like a personal holiness. It's like if you've ever been around somebody that you just know is a good person, or that you've been around someone that they really practice their faith seriously. They pray regularly. They try to be a good person. That's what we call piety. Someone who is pious is practicing religious piety. And so Catholicism outside of Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries and the 16th centuries as well, Catholicism outside of Italy at that time was practiced with a greater sense of personal faith. And so rather than observing outward signs and actions and simply going through the motions, the Catholicism outside of Italy tended to be one that was truly heartfelt. Many historians think that it's because these Northern European nation states were farther away from the influence of the papacy, and that meant that the Catholic Church in these various parts of Western Europe developed unique characteristics. And so, for instance, religious practices in France back in the 16th century were very different from the religious practices in Germany, or the religious practices in England were very different from the religious practices in Holland, and so forth. And so we begin to see, like Catholic, we begin to see the Catholic Church associating itself with a distinct national identity. So for the English Catholic Church, or the French Catholic Church, or the German Catholic Church, and so on. Let's go on to our next slide. Notice that the nation states of the Northern Renaissance were quite wealthy, and that was due to the fact that they all were located along the major trade routes from the 1200s up to the 1400s. And so all of these great nation states brought in a great deal of wealth, okay? And they also produced a great deal of textile, cloth and fabric. The textile industry was quite a moneymaker, especially if you look at the map here and you see, look in Northern Europe toward the North Sea, and you see a city there called Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, and Ghent was a very wealthy city that was known for its fabric, its cloth. Let's go on to our next slide. Christian humanism. Okay, another characteristic of the Northern Renaissance was what we call Christian humanism. Now, Christian humanism is like the Italian Renaissance version of humanism, except that it promotes personal faith and good morals through the academic process. So if you recall, in the Italian Renaissance, we had that wonderful quote from the Italian Renaissance, "Man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things." And that was the notion behind the Italian Renaissance humanism. Well, the Northern Renaissance had a notion of what we call Christian humanism, which also felt that man was the measure of all things, but in the sense that man was meant for God. Man was meant for God's salvation, to be saved by God. And so academic learning, when coupled with the reading of the Bible and the study of the Bible, can help lead one to a good and upright, righteous life. Hence, we call it Christian humanism. Some famous Christian humanists are pictured here. The first, we have Thomas Kempis, who was a Dutch cleric in the 15th century, known for his writing of The Imitation of Christ, is one of his most well-known books. And it was essentially dedicated to helping people lead a very good Christ-like life. And his image is there on the left-hand side, an engraving. We don't really know what Thomas looked like. He lived so long ago. Our next famous Christian humanist is Desiderius Erasmus, and he's pictured there in the middle. Now, that's a portrait of Erasmus painted by Hans Holbein. And Erasmus was a Dutch Christian humanist. He was a Latin scholar, he was a philosopher, he was a very intelligent man, but he was also a very faithful Catholic and dedicated to a life of prayer and scripture. And finally, we have Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, who was an English Chancellor of England, a philosopher, lawyer, very intelligent man, also a very devout Catholic, and interested very much in promoting a personal faith life. And so Thomas More is pictured on the far right-hand side, also in a painting by Hans Holbein. Let's go on to our next slide. Okay, the invention of the printing press. This is my last slide on the Northern Renaissance. One quality of the Northern Renaissance was the increased literacy that occurred because of publication of books. Now, Johann Gutenberg did not invent the printing press. He invented something specifically called movable type. But Gutenberg did not invent printing. Printing has always been around. The Chinese had printing, the Babylonians had printing, Persians had printing. But Johann Gutenberg invented what we call movable type, meaning that he could print in greater volume. He could print more in less time. I want you to think about that. He could print more books in less time. And that ultimately lowered the cost of books, making them more affordable for more people to read. And I hope you can see then the relationship between more books and increased literacy. On the left-hand image there shows a replica of Gutenberg's printing press. And on the right-hand image, that is a picture of a statue dedicated to Johann Gutenberg in Strasbourg, Alsace. And so that's one of the towns that I visited with some ND students a year ago. And we were able to see the area, the hometown where Gutenberg worked on his printing press.